Today I'm going to talk to you about using Shiva Paintstiks in your quilt making and in your garment making. Shiva oil paint sticks can be used to stencil or to rub or to do direct paint. This table runner was done entirely with Shiva Paintsticks, and it gives us a really nice applique look. You can also do more traditional things like this quilt here that has a nice kind of old-fashioned look. Looks like some Victorian applique, and very, very easy to use, very simple with stencils. The Shiva can also be used for garments, and this stencil was done on raw silk. The Shiva Paintsticks are very, very washable. You can put them in the washing machine and the dryer, and they're permanent and color fast. Okay, so now let me tell you about the products that we need to use to paint with the Shiva Paintsticks. First of all, it's the paint. We have two different types of paint, the professional and the iridescent. The professionals are packaged in a brown packaging and the iridescent in a blue packaging, so they're easy to tell apart. The iridescent are shiny and the professional are matte. The matte comes in about 108 colors and the iridescent only in about 20 colors. I tend to use the iridescent most because I really like that shininess, but they're both really great products and they can be used with each other. You also need some good brushes, stencil brushes if you're going to be stenciling. You can do a direct application with the crayon and not use a brush, but for most applications you're using stencil brushes. You can buy stencil brushes that are made for the Shiva Paintsticks that have a really short bristle, or you can cut down stencil brushes that you already have. Cut them so they're about 1/4 of an inch long. You're also going to need something to clean your brushes with. And this is a great product made by the company who makes the paint sticks, and it's an orange cleaner. But you can also use any type of other oil paint cleaner. The best thing that you need to have around for painting is baby wipes. Baby wipes have lanolin in them, and that lanolin easily removes the oil paint sticks from your skin, the surface of your tabletop, anything like that. But remember that as soon as it hits fabric, it's permanent. Now you can use commercially made stencils, such as these, to stencil with. They are slippery, however, so it's hard to get them to stay in place. You can master it, and they are simple to use, but I generally use freezer paper stencils that I've cut myself. You want to find freezer paper, it's usually in the bottom shelf at your grocery store in the paper goods aisle. You'll also need something to cut the stencils with. You can use a regular craft knife or an X-Acto knife like this, but my favorite tool is the swivel knife. The swivel knife fits on your finger like a pencil, and so it's really easy for you to guide it as you cut. I like to cut multiple stencils at one time, so I also need to have a stapler and a staple remover. And if your stencil has any fine small dots, polka dots, or circles on it, then a hole punch is really good too. So now let's get on to our project. Here's the block that we're going to paint today. And I got it from this design that I drew. I knew I wanted an 8-inch block, so I simply drew a design that would fit into an 8-inch square. This is just printed on regular copy paper, but then I transferred it onto freezer paper. You can do this by laying freezer paper on top of the printed design and tracing it, or if you can get this design into your computer by scanning it, then you can print this directly on your inkjet printer. Don't put freezer paper through a laser printer though, because it's a heat process and it will melt the wax all over the place, so just inkjet printers. Once I have the block the size I need it to be on the freezer paper, then I cut as many more pieces of freezer paper as I need to make blocks. So if I want 3 blocks, then I'll cut 3 more pieces of paper, or 2 more pieces of paper. And I'm going to stack them directly behind the printed paper and staple them together. So I want to keep the staples away from the gray areas, the shaded in areas, because those are the areas that I'm going to cut out. And I want to put enough staples in there just to hold the whole thing together. So here's how we cut it. And I'm using the swivel knife, and the swivel knife fits on your finger like you have a pencil at the end of your finger. And you simply want to keep the edge of the knife as close to the marked line as you possibly can. Because the knife is a swiveling knife, it moves for you, and you really don't have to do a whole lot of moving of the paper. If you're using a craft knife, however, you'll have to move the paper a bit more so that you can get a smooth cut. The knives can easily go through 3 or 4 layers. I try not to cut more than that at one time. If I try to do more than that, then I end up with jagged edges. The knife doesn't require you to use a whole lot of pressure, but a little bit of pressure. Make sure you keep your fingers out of the way so that you don't cut them, because the blade is very, very sharp. Okay, there we go. Now I'm just going to pop out the rest of these circles with the hole punch. And the stencil's ready to use. I just need to separate it. So I'm going to use a staple remover so that I don't damage the stencils. The stencils are pretty sturdy, but you can tear them. It's not that big of a deal, however, because you simply iron them in place and kind of mend that tear as you iron them down. So now we have 3 identical stencils, and we're ready to go ahead and paint our block. As we get ready to start painting, the first thing we have to do is put our stencil onto our fabric. So you want to center it in the middle of the square, and you're going to iron it down. Make sure that none of the portions of the stencil are turned upright so that the wax is showing to the top. Otherwise, it'll stick to your iron instead of sticking to the fabric. Set the iron down by lifting it up and moving it rather than by scooting it, and make sure things are just attached. And once you know that they're in the right place, then go ahead and leave the iron on for a few seconds, about to a count of 5 on each area, to make sure that the stencil is very well adhered to the fabric. Okay, now we're ready to paint. We're going to start with this block and then finish up on another block that I've already got partially painted. But first we need to prepare the paints. The paints come with a skin on them when they're brand new, and that skin's pretty thick. It has to be removed with a knife, a craft knife, and you want to just peel it like it's a very, very expensive potato, taking as little of the paint away as possible. After it's been skinned the first time, every time you use it after that, you can simply rough it up with a paper towel to remove the skin. Make sure there's no little bits of skin caught in the paint, however, because that can transfer to your fabric. Your paintbrush is a stencil brush again, and it needs to be about 1/4 inch long. If it's any longer than that, you can go ahead and shorten it with a pair of scissors by cutting it down. So we're going to start with this piece with gold in the center. And I tend to use paper plates for palettes. If you are to put the paint right on top of your stencil like this, little flakes of paint can get on your fabric, and you don't want that to happen. So you need something to work off of. So you can see here that I'm just going to rough the brush over the tip of the paint to load the brush, and then I'm going to wipe off any excess on my paper plate. And I'm going to take it to the center of the flower here, and I'm going to start adding paint to the center. Because this paint is not liquid, it's in an oil form, it has no viscosity. That means it can't move on its own. It's not going to run into another area. You have to push it into that area. So here I'm pushing it into the areas that I want it to go into, and I'm actually shading it out here into the flower petals. Once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and add the next color, which is a copper. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to load my brush off of the paint stick, kind of work it into the brush, and now I'm going to start painting the petals. And I'm going to work away from the paper edge into the center of the petal. And then work back into the paper edge so that I get a nice crisp edge. I'm going to go ahead and do this all the way around the flower. I have to add paint usually with every single petal. Once I have all of the petals done, I'm going to go ahead back with the gold paint, and I'm going to pull that paint back into the petals again. I'm doing this while the paint is wet, and it's called a wet application. You can also do this after the paint is dried, and not have as much of a flow from one color to the other. Just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and move to a block that I've already got almost completed and finish it up. Here I've painted the center already, painted the gold surround, and now I'm doing the red on the ends. Whenever you're painting on a dark fabric like this with the iridescence, you're going to have a little bit of show-through of the base fabric, which is really nice. It gives you a nice shadowy effect. But you can see how much I have to work the paint into the surface. You want to try to use a stencil brush that is size appropriate for the area that you're going to be painting in. I have a pretty big brush here because I have a pretty big area for this red color. I'm going to go ahead and add gold to the last few little dots here, these little circles. And then I'm going to highlight the tips of these red petals with gold also. Color blending is really easy with these paint sticks, and it can be done wet or dry. And if you don't like what you do, you simply paint over it. Okay, now we're going to remove the stencil from the paper. You can wait until it's somewhat dry if you want to, a couple of hours, or you can do it right away. I am not good at waiting, so I usually do it right away. It's easy to pull them off, and if you're not going to use the stencil again, you can just rip it off. But if you think you want to use the stencil again, and you can use it up to about 5 or 6 times, then you want to remove it somewhat carefully. So I tend to remove the outside edge first, and make sure you don't touch the painted areas because you can smear them. And once the outside edge is removed, any little pointy areas, like these areas here, I lift up with the X-Acto knife so that I don't tear the stencil. And once all those areas are lifted up, then I can pull the stencil off. And there we go. Our finished block. Now this block has to dry for about 24 hours before we can heat set it. They do need to be heat set. And this block here, the one I painted earlier, yesterday, is dry and it's ready to be heat set. The heat setting process is very, very important if you want to be able to launder your projects that have the paint on them. They need to be heat set for about 10 to 15 seconds per area that has paint on it. You want to have your iron set on a heat that the base fabric can handle, so mine's cotton, and so I have the iron set on cotton. And I'm simply going to set the iron down and count to 10, and then move it to another area, count to 10 again. You can smell the linseed oil when you iron these, but that smell will go away. It'll entirely dissipate in about 2 to 3 days. And now our block is finished. It's permanent, it's ready to use, and it can be washed and put in the dryer just like any other quilt or garment. And that's how we paint with Shiva Paintstiks. Here are 2 very different quilts that are made using Shiva Paintstiks in their entirety. This first one is a much more modern look than the one behind it. It features stenciled flowers and a painted background along with a machine quilted poem. The flowers are stenciled using freezer paper stencils that I cut and designed, and they're shaded with lots of different colors in them. The background was painted after it was quilted, and it has these fine lines of gold that were done with a direct application of the gold crown. The second quilt is pieced in a 9-patch formation with borders. Each of the blocks was painted with a Shiva Paintstiks using a stencil, and then it was pieced after it was painted. It was also very, very heavily machine quilted, and that quilting in the background allows the painted areas to come into the foreground and really, really look like hand applique. I hope that you can see how easy it is to add Shiva Paintsticks to your quilts and move into surface design. It's a really fun way to create.